The dark secrets of the Vikings that history never taught you. The sea was silent that morning. A cold mist drifted across the coast of northern England as the first light of dawn touched the stone walls of the monastery. Inside, monks moved quietly through narrow corridors lit by candlelight, whispering prayers while icy wind pressed against the wooden doors. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing warned them that history was about to change forever. Then the bells began to ring. Not slowly, not ceremonially, violently. One monk climbed the tower and froze in terror. Out there, emerging from the fog like creatures from another world, black ships were gliding across the water. Long, narrow shadows cutting through the sea with terrifying speed. At the front of each vessel stood carved dragon heads staring toward the shore as if the monsters themselves had come alive. The men inside the monastery had heard stories before, rumors carried by traders. Tales about northern raiders who appeared without warning and vanished like ghosts. But stories were one thing. This was real. The ships crashed against the shore. Warriors covered in fur and iron stormed onto the beach with axes in their hands and fury in their eyes. Doors shattered. Fires spread through the monastery halls. The sound of prayer was drowned by screams. And then something happened that terrified the survivors even more than the violence itself. The attackers did not look afraid. Not of death, not of pain, not even of God. To the monks, these men seemed less human and more like something sent from the edge of the world itself. Demons from the frozen north, warriors who believed that dying in battle was not a tragedy, but an honor. For centuries, history remembered the Vikings as fearless explorers, brutal raiders, and legendary conquerors. Modern culture transformed them into icons of strength and freedom. Movies glorified them. Television romanticized them. Stories turned them into heroes. But that version of the Vikings hides something much darker. Because the most terrifying truth about the Viking world was not simply the bloodshed they unleashed across Europe. It was the reality that violence shaped every corner of their existence long before their ships ever reached foreign shores. Behind the legends existed a civilization built on fear, survival, slavery, ritual sacrifice, revenge, and psychological terror. A world where children were raised to suppress weakness before they could even understand mercy. A world where human beings were bought and sold like livestock. A world where warriors entered battle in trance-like states, so savage that even their own allies feared standing beside them. And beneath all of it lived another secret few people ever discuss. The Vikings themselves were haunted by fear. Fear of dishonor, fear of the gods, fear of prophecy, fear that the world itself was doomed to destruction. The deeper you travel into their history, the more unsettling the truth becomes. Archaeologists uncovered mass graves hidden beneath ancient settlements. Forgotten chronicles described rituals too disturbing for medieval writers to fully explain. Norse sagas whispered stories of sacrifices, betrayals, curses, and horrors buried beneath centuries of myth. This was not just the story of warriors. It was the story of a civilization forged in ice and shaped by brutality. And to truly understand the Vikings, you must leave behind the fantasy created by modern culture and step into the cold darkness of the world that created them. A world ruled by fear, ritual, survival, and blood. The frozen world that created the Vikings. Long before the Vikings became the terror of Europe, Scandinavia itself was already a prison built by nature. Endless forests swallowed the land beneath permanent shadows, mountains isolated entire communities for months, and freezing oceans turned survival into a daily battle against death. Winter was not simply a season in the north. It was an enemy. A failed harvest could condemn families to starvation before spring arrived, while violent storms erased fishing crews without warning. Every year demanded endurance. Every year tested who was strong enough to survive. This brutal environment shaped the Viking mind from childhood. Boys and girls grew up surrounded by hunger, cold, blood, and loss. They watched fathers disappear into storms and mothers struggle to keep families alive through endless winters. In many villages, weakness was not seen as unfortunate. It was dangerous. A single vulnerable season could destroy an entire household, and over generations, survival itself became the center of Viking identity. The North hardened people emotionally long before it ever hardened them physically. Violence was also deeply rooted inside Scandinavian society before the famous raids even began. Small settlements competed constantly for land, resources, and power. Blood feuds between families could continue for generations, and revenge was often considered necessary to preserve honor. Refusing to answer violence with violence could make a family appear weak in the eyes of rivals. In a world with fragile political structures and limited protection, reputation became a weapon. Fear became a form of security. Even the Viking gods reflected this harsh reality. Norse mythology was filled with suffering, betrayal, war, and inevitable destruction. Odin sacrificed parts of himself in pursuit of wisdom. Thor fought endlessly against chaos and monsters, and above all stood Ragnarok, the prophecy that foretold the violent end of the world and the death of the gods themselves. Imagine growing up in a society where even divine beings were doomed. The Vikings did not worship gods of peace. They worshipped gods who endured pain, sacrifice, and war. Because death surrounded them constantly, the Vikings developed a relationship with fear that separated them from much of medieval Europe. They did not necessarily become fearless. They simply became familiar with suffering. The freezing sea, the darkness of winter, the threat of starvation, and the violence between clans made mortality feel unavoidable from an early age. This is one reason Viking warriors shocked their enemies so deeply. Many of them entered battle already believing that fate had decided the moment of their death long before the fight even began. The world often remembers the Vikings as savage invaders who appeared suddenly from the sea. But the truth began much earlier, hidden inside the frozen silence of Scandinavia itself. The Viking raids were not born from simple greed or madness. They emerged from generations shaped by isolation, hardship, fear, and survival. The cold North created people capable of enduring things most societies could not imagine. And as their populations grew, that brutal survival instinct began pushing outward toward the rest of Europe. But survival alone did not build the Viking world. Soon, another force would transform their raids into something far darker and far more profitable than conquest alone. The Viking Empire was built on slavery. When most people imagine the Vikings, they picture burning villages, silver treasures, and warriors carrying axes through clouds of smoke. But hidden beneath the legends of conquest was a truth far darker than most history books ever discuss. The Viking economy did not depend only on gold, raids, or trade. It depended on human beings. Thousands of men, women, and children were captured, sold, and transported across Europe like cargo. Behind the dragon ships and heroic myths existed one of the largest slave networks of the medieval world. For many Viking raiders, people were more valuable than treasure. Gold could be spent once. Slaves could generate wealth for years. Entire coastal villages disappeared during Viking attacks, not because everyone was killed, but because survivors were dragged onto ships and taken north in chains. Young women were especially prized. Children could be sold into servitude across distant markets. Strong men were forced into labor. Families were separated forever in a matter of minutes while smoke consumed their homes behind them. The Viking trade routes stretched far beyond Scandinavia. Captives taken from England, Ireland, Francia, and Eastern Europe were transported through massive commercial networks that reached the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. In markets filled with merchants speaking dozens of languages, human beings were treated as currency. Some slaves worked farms in the north. Others became servants, concubines, laborers, or sacrificial victims during elite Viking rituals. Archaeologists and ancient chronicles suggest that slavery was not a hidden part of Viking society. It was deeply integrated into everyday life. Imagine the terror of seeing the horizon filled with dragon-headed ships, knowing escape was impossible. Medieval accounts describe raids that moved with terrifying speed. Villages barely had time to react before armed warriors crashed through their streets. The strongest were restrained first. The elderly and weak were often abandoned or killed. Mothers watched children ripped from their arms, while captives were forced toward the shoreline under armed guard. For countless victims, the sea itself became a symbol of horror, because once the ships disappeared into the fog, nobody knew if those taken would ever be seen again. This reality completely changes the image modern culture often presents about the Vikings. They were not only explorers searching for adventure or fearless warriors seeking glory. Many raids were carefully planned economic operations designed to capture human cargo. Wealthy Viking leaders built power through ownership of land, silver, ships, and slaves. Some historians believe the demand for forced labor became one of the driving engines behind Viking expansion itself. The ships returning home from raids did not carry only treasure. They carried chains, grief, and stolen lives. And yet, this brutal system created another terrifying consequence inside Viking society. The constant exposure to violence, domination, and human suffering slowly transformed warfare into something even darker. Because among the Vikings, there were warriors so feared that even their own allies believed they had stopped being fully human. Berserkers, the warriors even Vikings feared. Before the battle began, the warriors started to change. Witnesses described men shaking violently beside the fire, breathing like animals while gripping their weapons with trembling hands. Some bit their own shields until blood ran from their mouths. Others screamed into the night sky as if trying to awaken something buried deep inside themselves. Then, without warning, the transformation came. Their eyes lost all restraint. Fear disappeared. Pain seemed meaningless. And when the fighting started, they charged forward with a level of fury so terrifying that enemies sometimes broke ranks before the first strike even landed. These men became known as berserkers, among the most feared warriors of the Viking world. But the deeper historians investigate their existence, the more disturbing the mystery becomes. Medieval accounts claimed berserkers fought in trance-like states, almost immune to fear and injury. Some stories described them tearing through enemy lines with uncontrollable violence, killing with such brutality that even hardened Viking warriors kept their distance. To outsiders, they looked less like soldiers and more like human beings surrendering themselves to something monstrous. No one knows exactly how berserkers entered these states. Some historians believe they used hallucinogenic substances or powerful alcohol mixtures before battle. Others argue the transformation came from extreme psychological conditioning developed through ritual practices repeated over years. Norse mythology also played a major role. Berserkers were closely connected to Odin, the god associated with war, frenzy, death, and sacrifice. Many believed these warriors did not simply fight for Odin. They believed Odin fought through them. Animal symbolism surrounded the berserkers everywhere they went. Some wore wolf or bear skins during combat, believing they absorbed the spirit and strength of the creature itself. This was not symbolic theater to the Vikings. In their world, the line between man, nature, and the supernatural felt dangerously thin. Entering battle was not always viewed as a military act. Sometimes it resembled ritual transformation. The warrior abandoned ordinary humanity and became something driven entirely by instinct, rage, and destruction. What terrified people most was the loss of control. Ancient stories suggest berserkers sometimes attacked allies after battles ended because the frenzy did not immediately disappear. Entire villages feared what these men could become once violence consumed them completely. Even among Viking societies built around warfare and strength, berserkers represented something unstable and dangerous. They embodied the fear that under the right conditions, human beings could abandon reason entirely and surrender themselves to pure brutality. The enemy feared them, but so did their own people. And while berserkers unleashed chaos on the battlefield, another darkness waited far from war itself. Hidden deep inside sacred forests and surrounded by firelight and blood, the Vikings performed rituals so disturbing that even medieval chroniclers struggled to describe what they witnessed: blood rituals and human sacrifice. Deep inside the forests of the north, far from villages and hidden beneath towering trees, the Vikings gathered in places few outsiders were ever allowed to see. Sacred groves stood in silence beneath the cold sky, while torches flickered against carved wooden idols stained by smoke, animal blood, and years of ritual offerings. These were not places of peaceful worship. They were places where the boundary between the human world and the world of the gods was believed to open. And what happened there terrified even some medieval observers who heard the stories. The Viking gods were not worshipped through kindness alone. Odin, Thor, and the other Norse deities demanded sacrifice, loyalty, and proof of devotion. During times of famine, war, plague, or disaster, rituals became darker and more desperate. Animals were slaughtered publicly while blood was collected and scattered across altars, weapons, and participants. But according to ancient chronicles and archaeological discoveries, there were moments when animals were no longer considered enough. Human beings themselves became offerings. One of the most chilling accounts came from the Great Temple at Uppsala in Sweden, where medieval writers described ceremonies involving executions carried out in honor of the gods. Victims were allegedly hanged from sacred trees, while priests performed rituals beneath them. Archaeologists have also uncovered graves suggesting that servants and slaves were buried alive or killed during the funerals of powerful Viking leaders. Some accounts described women forced to die beside wealthy warriors so they could continue serving them in the afterlife. Death itself became part of the ritual economy of Viking power. To the modern world, these acts seem horrifying beyond comprehension. But inside Viking society, many believed sacrifice maintained balance between humanity and the divine. The gods controlled storms, harvests, victory, disease, and fate itself. If the gods became displeased, entire communities could suffer. This belief transformed ritual violence into something terrifyingly sacred. The victims were not always seen as murdered. In many cases, they were believed to be part of a necessary exchange between mortals and forces beyond human control. The atmosphere surrounding these ceremonies must have felt overwhelming. Smoke rising into freezing air, drums echoing through the forest, torches illuminating faces filled with fear and devotion. Snow absorbing the sound of footsteps while entire communities stood silently before the altar. The Vikings lived in a world where religion was not distant from violence. It was intertwined with it. Their spirituality carried blood at its center, because survival itself often seemed dependent on forces they could neither predict nor fully understand. The Norse gods did not promise peace. They demanded sacrifice. And hidden behind many of these rituals stood figures even kings feared to challenge. Women who spoke with spiritual authority, manipulated alliances, and shaped Viking destiny from the shadows without ever raising a sword themselves. The secret power of Viking women. When people imagine Viking women, they often picture shield maidens standing beside warriors on the battlefield. But the true influence of women inside Viking society was far more complex, far more political, and in many cases far more dangerous. Some of the most feared figures in the Viking world never carried axes or sailed into battle. They ruled through knowledge, manipulation, prophecy, and the ability to influence the decisions of men powerful enough to shape kingdoms. Among the most mysterious women in Norse culture were the seeresses, spiritual figures believed to possess supernatural insight into fate and the will of the gods. These women traveled between settlements wearing elaborate clothing decorated with staffs, jewelry, animal skins, and ritual objects that symbolized their connection to forces beyond ordinary human understanding. Viking leaders often sought their guidance before wars, alliances, and major decisions. In a world obsessed with destiny and prophecy, the words of a seeress could alter the future of entire clans. But spiritual influence was only part of their power. Viking society operated through family alliances, blood ties, marriage arrangements, and revenge networks that often depended heavily on women working behind the scenes. A marriage could unite rival clans or ignite future wars. An insult against one woman could trigger years of violent retaliation between families. In some sagas, women manipulated conflicts intentionally, encouraging husbands, brothers, and sons toward revenge in order to preserve family honor or gain political advantage. Quiet conversations inside longhouses sometimes shaped history more effectively than battles themselves. Poison also became associated with fear surrounding powerful women in Norse storytelling. Unlike open combat, poison represented secrecy, patience, and hidden control. Medieval accounts and Viking sagas contain disturbing stories of betrayals carried out during feasts, marriages, and political negotiations where enemies suddenly collapsed after drinking from ceremonial cups. Whether every story was true mattered less than the fear they created. In Viking culture, the idea that danger could emerge from inside the home itself added another layer of psychological tension to an already violent society. Even wealthy Viking households reflected this hidden influence. While men traveled on raids or trade expeditions, women often controlled farms, property, servants, finances, and local authority. Some became remarkably powerful during the long absences of husbands and sons. Archaeological discoveries reveal graves of elite women buried with extraordinary objects, suggesting social status that extended far beyond domestic life. Certain women commanded respect powerful enough to survive centuries inside legend and myth. Some of the most dangerous figures in Viking society never carried swords. And while spiritual influence and political manipulation shaped the Viking world from within, there existed another terror that enforced order through fear alone. Punishments so brutal and humiliating that many Vikings feared dishonor more than death itself. The punishments Vikings feared most. The Viking world was built on reputation. Honor determined who deserved loyalty, power, land, protection, and respect. A strong reputation could elevate a man into leadership. A damaged reputation could destroy his entire future. In a society where survival depended heavily on alliances and fear, punishment was not simply about pain. It was about humiliation, isolation, and public destruction. Some fates were considered worse than death itself. Among the darkest stories connected to Viking punishment stands the terrifying legend of the Blood Eagle. According to medieval accounts, certain enemies accused of betrayal or unforgivable crimes were executed through a ritual so horrifying that historians still debate whether it truly happened. The victims' ribs were supposedly cut from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings, while the lungs were exposed behind the body. Some scholars believe the story was exaggerated by Christian chroniclers trying to portray the Vikings as monsters. Others argue fragments of truth may exist beneath the myth. What matters is that even centuries later, the mere possibility continues to disturb historians and audiences alike. Public executions also played a powerful role inside Viking society. Punishment was often meant to send a message to entire communities. Thieves, traitors, murderers, or oath breakers could face hanging, mutilation, torture, or ritual humiliation before crowds gathered to witness the consequences. Violence became part of social control. Fear maintained order where centralized authority remained weak. In some regions, local assemblies known as things judged crimes publicly, and sentences carried enormous psychological weight because they affected not only individuals, but entire families connected to them. Yet one punishment terrified Vikings more than physical torture: exile. To be declared an outlaw meant losing legal protection completely. An outlaw could be robbed, hunted, or killed by anyone without consequence. Friends could abandon him. Family members risked punishment for offering shelter. The condemned person became socially dead while still physically alive, forced to survive alone in one of the harshest environments on Earth. In a culture built around clan loyalty and communal survival, exile transformed isolation into a living nightmare. Many Vikings viewed it as a fate more terrifying than execution itself. This obsession with honor created constant psychological pressure throughout Viking life. Every insult carried potential consequences. Every conflict risked escalation. A man who failed to defend his reputation could lose alliances, marriage opportunities, wealth, and status. Violence became deeply connected to identity because fear of humiliation haunted daily existence. The Vikings did not simply fear pain. They feared becoming forgotten, powerless, or dishonored in the eyes of their society. In Viking society, losing your honor could erase your existence more completely than death. And this culture of fear did not begin during adulthood. Long before Viking boys ever stepped onto a battlefield, their world had already begun shaping them into warriors through childhood itself. Viking children were raised for violence. A Viking child entered a world where survival mattered more than innocence. From an early age, boys and girls witnessed things most modern societies would hide from children completely. They saw animals slaughtered for food during brutal winters. They heard stories of revenge, raids, and executions beside firelight. They watched fathers leave for distant voyages, knowing some would never return. In many settlements, death was not treated as a distant tragedy. It was a constant presence woven into everyday life. Young boys especially were shaped by expectations of strength long before reaching adulthood. Physical pain was often treated as something to endure silently because emotional weakness carried dangerous consequences in Viking society. Children learned quickly that fear had to be controlled, hunger had to be tolerated, and hardship had to be faced without complaint. Games frequently imitated combat. Wrestling, weapon practice, endurance tests, and hunting became part of preparation for the adult world waiting ahead. By adolescence, many boys already understood that their future might depend on their ability to fight and survive. Stories also played a powerful role in shaping the Viking mind. Norse legends celebrated warriors who faced impossible odds without fear, men who chose death over dishonor, and heroes who earned glory through violence and sacrifice. These stories were not simple entertainment. They functioned almost like psychological conditioning. Children absorbed the idea that reputation outlived the body itself, and that courage could make a person immortal through memory even after death. Fear of being forgotten became as powerful as fear of dying. But this upbringing created emotional consequences that rarely appear in romanticized portrayals of the Vikings. Constant exposure to violence hardened entire generations psychologically. Mercy could appear dangerous. Compassion could be interpreted as weakness. Some children likely grew into adulthood carrying trauma shaped by famine, conflict, raids, and brutal punishments witnessed throughout their lives. The Viking world demanded emotional control so intensely that vulnerability itself became threatening inside many communities. Even family relationships reflected this harsh environment. Fathers often trained sons through discipline rather than affection, preparing them for a world believed to have little mercy. Honor passed from one generation to another like inheritance, and family reputation depended heavily on the actions of children as they matured. A cowardly son could stain an entire bloodline. A strong son could elevate it. Under this pressure, childhood slowly transformed into preparation for survival inside a violent society. The Vikings did not create warriors during war. They created them during childhood. And despite all this strength, brutality, and obsession with honor, the Viking world was haunted by a fear so deep that it shaped their religion, their myths, and the way they viewed the future itself. The fear that haunted the Vikings. The Vikings terrified much of Europe because they seemed fearless. They sailed directly into storms that frightened experienced sailors. They charged into battle against impossible odds. They treated death as if it were simply another step toward glory. To their enemies, these warriors looked almost unstoppable. But hidden beneath that image existed a truth far more unsettling. The Vikings lived with a constant fear that the world itself was doomed. At the center of Norse belief stood Ragnarok, the prophecy of the end. According to their mythology, a catastrophic final war would one day consume gods, monsters, humanity, and the earth itself. The sky would darken, the seas would rise, giants and beasts would march across the world, while Odin, Thor, Loki, and the other gods faced destruction in one final battle. Unlike many religions that promised ultimate salvation, Norse mythology accepted that even the gods could not escape fate. Victory was never guaranteed. Destruction was inevitable. This belief shaped the Viking mindset in profound ways. Courage became meaningful precisely because life was fragile and temporary. Honor mattered because death could arrive at any moment. Many Vikings believed a dishonorable death condemned a person to obscurity, while dying bravely offered the possibility of entering Valhalla, Odin's great hall of fallen warriors. Fear of being forgotten haunted them constantly. To disappear without legacy or reputation was considered a fate almost as terrifying as death itself. Omens and prophecies also carried enormous psychological power inside Viking society. Strange weather, unusual animal behavior, eclipses, dreams, or unexpected disasters could all be interpreted as warnings from the gods. Seeresses and spiritual figures gained influence, partly because people desperately wanted guidance in a world they believed was controlled by unpredictable supernatural forces. Imagine living every day convinced that fate had already written the story of your life somewhere beyond your control. That belief created both courage and anxiety at the same time. This contradiction became one of the defining characteristics of Viking culture. The same people who raided kingdoms and crossed oceans in search of wealth also feared invisible forces constantly watching over them. The same warriors who laughed in the face of battle worried about curses, destiny, and divine punishment. Beneath their brutal reputation lived a society deeply aware of mortality and cosmic collapse. Their violence was not always born from confidence. Sometimes it emerged from fear itself. The Vikings conquered kingdoms while fearing the collapse of existence itself. And slowly, over generations, the prophecy of endings began to take shape in the real world. Not through one final battle, but through something far more tragic. The slow death of the Viking world had already begun. The slow death of the Viking world. The end of the Viking Age did not arrive with one final battle or a single moment of collapse. There was no dramatic last stand beneath burning skies. No legendary king watching his empire fall into the sea. Instead, the Viking world died slowly, almost silently, over generations. The same people who once terrified Europe began changing from within as the old beliefs, traditions, and ways of life gradually disappeared. Christianity spread across Scandinavia village by village, kingdom by kingdom, replacing the gods that had ruled the north for centuries. Churches rose where sacred groves once stood. Crosses replaced the symbols of Odin and Thor. Kings who once built power through raids and warrior loyalty now sought legitimacy through alliances with Christian Europe. The brutal independence that defined Viking society slowly gave way to centralized kingdoms, written laws, and new systems of authority that no longer revolved entirely around honor and revenge. trade also transformed the North. Raiding became less profitable as European kingdoms strengthened their defenses and developed organized armies capable of resisting Viking attacks. The world itself was changing. Wealth could now be gained more safely through commerce, politics, and diplomacy rather than endless violence. The great dragon ships that once appeared like nightmares along foreign coastlines became symbols of a fading era. Over time, fewer young men sought glory through raiding because the society that created those warriors was disappearing. But perhaps the greatest transformation happened inside the Viking mind itself. The old stories began losing power. Ragnarok no longer shaped the future the way it once had. Ritual sacrifices faded. Sacred traditions vanished. Children grew up under different beliefs than their ancestors. The fear, brutality, and survival instincts that had defined Viking society for generations slowly weakened beneath the influence of a changing world. The North was no longer isolated from Europe. It was becoming part of it, yet traces of the Viking spirit never truly vanished. Their influence remained hidden inside languages, trade routes, exploration, warfare, and mythology. Even today, centuries later, the image of the Viking continues to fascinate the modern world because it represents something primal and deeply human. Strength against impossible odds, the struggle for survival, the fear of death, the desire to be remembered. But behind the legend stood real people shaped by hardship, violence, belief, and fear in ways far darker than most stories ever reveal. The Vikings did not disappear in fire and glory. They vanished slowly as the world they believed in died around them. And somewhere beneath the cold fog of the North, abandoned ships still rest beneath the earth like ghosts from another age, silent reminders of a civilization forged in ice, blood, fear, and survival.